Politicians have to be reasonable. That's the one. I agree with you. But in our system, we have to elect unreasonable people like me so that there is a marketplace of ideas. And that is the clash of ideas that produces in a deliberative body the wisdom of the majority and the protection of the rights of the minority. That is critical. You know, as a politician, many democracies, we love to hate politicians. But the reality is that there is no truth to the rumor that we are the lowest forms of life. The reality is that we are able to compromise, find solutions to problems. And when we say this is reasonable, that is subject to challenge. Your definition of reasonableness may be different from the others. And so we have representatives from various sectors who may be unreasonable in their ways of arguing, but that is fine because that's a democracy. So in our case, when I was given the question here, it says, what would be the role of the legislator in the peaceful settlement of disputes and promoting rules-based governance? Well, it's asking too much, but there's a lot that they can do as well. Peaceful settlement, you know, we have all serious problems. All countries have serious problems. In our case, we are a developing democracy, and we have defined our national interests in the context of a market economy as well as a democratic state. So in our case, we are not neutral. We're pro-democracy. That's something. Neutrality is not just an attitude. It is woven into the system of governance. You did mention also that aside from reasonableness, you talked about validity. It has to be valid to be binding. Like reasonableness, who is to determine what is reasonable and what is not? In terms of validity, are you going to follow only the rules or the decisions that suit you? Those that do not suit you are not valid. So actually, we have a great difference in systems, but we have to agree to disagree. That's very important. The national interest, core interest of China. I think my good friend Dr. Renato Dela. Yes, Rene, nandiyan ka pala. Kaklase ko yan. He was my classmate when I was taking my doctorate in UP, and I used to copy from him. That's why I almost failed. I didn't know it was wrong that I was copying. Anyway, going back to no, we can agree to disagree. South China Sea is something China has indicated. You say Tibet is ours. You say Taiwan is ours. Okay, you say South China Sea is ours. From you, for your point of view, that's valid. So we have a vast chasm that separates us. While we cannot solve this, and we should not solve it with violence, we have to manage it. But you have to, when you manage, you give and take. That's the nature of politics. Politics is all about power. So there is always going to be a power play. We know that you are undertaking political warfare on us. It's, there is no kinetic warfare yet. You're still using laser beams and hoses, water hoses. But we're concerned that it might get to that. So we have to talk. We have to have guardrails. We have to manage our relationship. If that is happening, then I think we can sleep a little better. We're not out to get, out to, you know, our objective is not to outpace your military. By gum, we have many other problems to solve in this country, and to think of how we can buy missiles and jets and submarines, etc. I was Secretary of Defense. I know the problems of the military. But I tell you, we're not asking for a fight. But please do not tell us that this this decision of the arbitral court is not valid and it's not reasonable for you. That's fine. It's your point of view. But when you prevent us from benefiting from what is rightfully ours, I do not believe. I do not believe in the DFA. I told your secretary already. I do not agree with the statement that we are friends to all and enemies to none. Aristotle said, if you are friends to all, you have no real friend. There's none. You become the doormat. And we have to stand up. You know, we even sing that in our national anthem. Hindi tayo pasisil. Ano kasunod doon? Hanggang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo. Okay. So, meaning we're going to fight. I will be there using a slingshot. But you can assure us, we can assure you that there will be openness in our conversations.
Well, as soon as you talk about fight, I don't know what to say. I will leave it to other people. I prefer the library.
No, I said we will. I said we will not fight. We will not. Yeah,
For the library.
Yes. We agree with this political warfare can go on. No problem. As long as
Also, books can be weapons.
yes, as long as it's moving up, and we believe that our chance, what belongs to us, our exclusive economic zone, will just vanish if we do not.
Yeah,
And you can understand our position.
As I was talking during my presentation, I just would like to consider this tribunal's decision to be valid. But if you are willing to reconsider that point, then you will see that many things would need to follow. I do not need to go into all the details here. I think the views are already well known. So I do agree with you that it's important to talk, to recognize that we have differences of opinion, and that precisely because of these differences, we should be here and talk. Okay, thank you.
By the way, are you a signatory? Is China a signatory to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea?
China is a party, but then, as I mentioned to you, the interpretation of these provisions are not as simple as you may have
But
presented.
you could have said that in the arbitral court. You could have challenged it. That's democracy.
Well, we believe, the
You don't believe in democracy?
democracy is in a different realm. Okay, this is a decision from from a tribunal, and if this is legal, this is what we call the matters for lawyers to make it simpler.
Yes.
Okay, and let me put in one more point. Okay, this is a matter for lawyers, and China apparently from all the materials I hope I can relate I can summarize these positions here, but I don't think I can, okay, because the views are quite sophisticated and quite complicated. China believes that it's so obvious that the tribunal has no jurisdiction, and therefore it took the course it had taken. Okay, so
I'm just curious. If the decision of the arbitral court was that this nine dash line is valid, it's reasonable, and you own the whole of China Sea, would you have followed it?
Well, I'm not, I think ready to, respond to an hypothetical kind of situation.
It was an hypothetical,
But
it could have happened.
if you take a look at the government's position, the government said that, well, we are open to negotiation. You know what I mean? And that's a point.
As
that,
long as we're reasonable and we
yes,
follow valid
yes,
agreements.
as long as you're reasonable and I think it has already been mentioned. I think this morning, if you go back by 7 years or 8 years or whatever, there was even a trilateral agreement between and among China, the Philippines, and Vietnam to do joint exploration on the South China Sea. So I'm not quite sure that you know the current road need to be the only road. Okay, thank you.
Maybe we can also ask your views because it's very critical, really, when you come to think of it. How, you know, I always believe it. I keep telling my students, okay, you got me to the heads. Hindsight, insight, foresight. And the history of Germany is very instructive of war and what happened in the past. The horrors of war should be something that we are always reminded of so that we will really avoid it. So, what advice can you give us considering that you were also a divided nation at one time? You have seen all of these dynamics of territorial squabbles, etc. What can you share with us in terms of the legislative work?
Thank you, Mr. Orlando. First of all, I would like to be very decent and humble as a guest here. And I'm really grateful that we sit together, involve China, engage China, and do not speak only about it so that we can exchange arguments. And I believe, as you mentioned, a lesson identified, I hope also learned for Germany, is that you need an attitude. You cannot stay in between. And as we did since 1990 until 2014, we cannot sit on the fence. On the fence, looking what others are doing, commenting from the sideline. This was our evil. And a second lesson identified is that we have to get rid of three lifelines of German unification. The first lifeline after unification was we are surrounded by partners and friends, and therefore we could take care on our own and need not to engage abroad and with others. So our own mitigation was development policy, but not a strong diplomacy focused on interests and values, and interests first and then values. Because of our focus on ourselves, we invested much in social cohesion. The German unification costed about $2 billion or euros, similar the same. It's nearly the number of our state debt now. And we invested in social cohesion instead of modernizing the country. So we always need to look, if you have the chance to save money, to have a leeway, then invest in societal cohesion by digitalization, by infrastructure, by educational training, by vocational training, by modernization. We have invested in social welfare. That's not so bad, but it is not the best solution. And the third lifeline was we needed to finance that. And therefore we relied on, and now it's the region, we relied on cheap supply chains from China, cheap energy from Russia, very cheap, and cheap security from the United States. They did much more for Germans and European security than the Germans, French, and Americans did. So we invested about 1% of our GDP, whereas we should invest at least 2% for national defense. I say this because you mentioned our history. Since 1945, until the late 70s, there was the phase of re-education to form a pacified society. And this is the challenge for the United States and other countries why Germans are so reluctant. And now we pay the price because we are too reluctant to support Ukraine full-fledged. And another change was we became democrats. Some 80 or 90 or 100 or even 150 years ago, it would have been impossible for me as an officer to become a politician, even if I was to quit the service. So now it is possible. We have a very few number of officers in our parliament. Really, that's a one-digit number out of 730. So it is not very usable. But it is necessary, and this is really important, that we listen to others and try to be open-minded for engagement when we are asked. So where we could help, for example, is the question of South and North Korea. What is the price for the preparation of unification? And also the question Taiwan and China. Our lesson learned from 2014 in the beginning was, well, we invest in Russian infrastructure and purchase Nord Stream 2, this is a gas pipeline, instead of strengthening Ukraine. So what we could choose now, together with the region, if you so wish, that we have on the one side the diplomatic approach to convince China that there is a peaceful solution, and second, and this is the hard power, the other was the soft power, to make Taiwan to a kind of fortress mentally and physically, that the price for an invasion or for a blockade is too high for China, so that there is a peaceful coexistence in the view of both countries and with the law of both countries, but executed in their respective countries. I hope this might be a helpful advice, but I'm not allowed to give any advice here.
We will not pass judgment whether it's reasonable or not. Don't worry. Anyway, we'll open the floor for questions or comments.
Tourism in Asia Pacific University. China has been talking about its historical rights, but nobody has historically pumped oil and gas from the seabed. Fishermen have fished in the water, and if that's what China is asking, maybe there's a room for negotiating. And fish is a common property, and which is actually to your advantage, because no matter how hard the EEZ claims will try to squeeze Chinese fishermen out, fish swim around with no respect for the boundaries. So unless you all cooperate, you all will lose fish. It's not sustainable. And if it's the case, maybe they will all talk to China. And if China sees a reasonable share of the fish as a first step toward the code of conduct, maybe there is something you can agree on. Thank you.
I think, as I already mentioned, these views are already, well discussed, and there are government papers and scholarly papers published. I don't think we need to repeat, these, positions here. I think, as you mentioned, China is open for discussion and negotiation. Of course, it would depend on the particular position that you can or the involved parties can get. Of course, as I mentioned, hopefully everything will be reasonable at the end. And as to our colleague here, his point about Taiwan and all that, also the government's position is very clear, and I don't think I can repeat them here. But As I mentioned yesterday, our friends usually would say that, well, you Europeans deal with your European problems first. Maybe, the situation isn't that nice. It's a bit mess. Maybe perhaps not so much advice should be given all over the world, because I think my hunch is that during the, these 2 days of discussion, I think more needed to be done to study the positions more carefully for a more fruitful discussion, I think. The government made very clear many points about the Thailand situation, and the way you're talking about it in this way, in a very, how should I say, casual or cavalierly way, it aches my heart. But what can I do? Thank you.
No, actually, it aches my heart also. When we have such an opaque legislature that you have, we don't know what's happening. So we don't know the debates, etc. Now you take a position already, it comes down, and everybody follows in terms of your government. That's. But we have to take into consideration the fact that we have. It's easier to understand us. We debate. We disagree openly. And then when we come up with a decision, that's put to the people and ratified in many ways. Our Senate ratifies treaties and international agreements, etc., and that's subject to debate. Now we don't see the debate in your Congress, and we don't. That's the reason why we're kept in the dark. So when you say it's valid or it's reasonable, are you saying that just because China is saying it, because it is a rich country now and has a powerful military, it is valid and it is right? And are you saying that right is might? No, why don't we? Why, you said we should not go back and agree or on discuss these things. That's precisely the point. We cannot have a situation wherein these things are not discussed.
It seems to me that you are talking about a question of working method of the parliamentarians. As I'm not a member of the parliamentarian, maybe you can send your suggestions to the parliamentarians on their working method. But it seems to me that on this point, there's reason to respect each other's own working method. Okay? Also, it seems to me that as long as we are looking for what's reasonable, it's more important for us to see the reasonable results rather than other things. So I would like to ask you, maybe you can check the results rather than other things. Thank you.
Okay, from Indonesia.
1,000 friends, zero enemies, or 1 million friends, zero enemies. You know, a stuck line from President SBY, because the state of Indonesia doesn't consider any countries. Comment to Mr. Kisweta, non-alignment is not neutrality. Indonesia has always held very firmly to free and active foreign policy, and you don't sit on the fence when it comes to law. But as you know, ASEAN takes a position of strategic autonomy vis-a-vis great power rivalry because we don't want to be dragged into one side or the other. But I don't think that there is any sense of sitting on a fence when it comes to international law. I think that we made that very clear.
Thank you.
You have a hard time in this past 2 days, and I really admire you in a rather, it's one against,
Against all, huh?
Against all. So I really admire,
Now the world is not, is it reasonable?
But the point of view, is I rather that lawyers throw papers at each other than your armed militia and your armed coast guard chasing fishermen and getting into contact, So I'd rather have more of this, you might call repeating it over and over again and wasting lots of time talking, but we avoid conflict from each other. But I just like to reiterate over and over again here. I attended a conference in Singapore just not too long after, just a few years, just before COVID. And that was the first time when we, the ASEAN people and Chinese friends said, well, there's international law, and then there is major power exceptionalism. Frankly, we took that, that's one way that the rule of law and international laws apply to middle powers and smaller countries, but a big power can do whatever it wants. Is it the position of China now? If that is the case, just say it out that you'll only respect international law as far as it serves your interest, but because you're now big, you can afford to disregard it. Because if that is the case, I think you're going to have a problem. Despite the amount of money and the political will that China has earned, China is now wasting away that political will, because now more and more there's a lot of distrust. So the ASEAN states take China's money, but it doesn't trust China. And I don't think that is tenable in the long run.
You talked about, it has never been China's position that only certain international rules will be respected, as you talked about. It has always been China's position that we respect sovereign equality. We do not interfere in the domestic affairs of other states. We've been talked about many times, So China does not distinguish between big states, big powers, and other states and other powers. As I argued earlier, I argue that the prescription medicine for other parts of the world should be the same, as for this part of the world. So I'm not quite sure, what kind of conference that you were talking about. I was not there. Thank you very much.
Any other comments? Yeah, please.
On to one point about this skirmishes, hearing about, we have been reading about. If you take a look at who took the first step, I would say that, China is not the one that has taken the first step. When someone took the first step, China, of course, had to defend its own interest, and has to be effective in doing that. In this situation, you cannot really blame China for taking its own rights seriously, for taking countermeasures or response measures in a forceful way. Otherwise, it cannot defend itself.
Sorry to interfere, if I may. This sounds excellent. However, we need to have the proof in the practice. And then we see that rocks become airports and harbors. And the question of historic rights is a very tricky question, for example, in Europe, because you have civilizations and populations being in wars since 1,000 years. And therefore, we must find an end to historic rights and accept a rule-based order which is trying to mitigate the endless quoting of historic rights which have been overcome by reality.
Well, just one moment. I guess if you look at international legal materials, there was a very nice report, in my view, pretty good, produced by the UN Secretariat in the 1950s and 1960s, saying that historic rights are there and valid if you can prove it. So you are saying that, well, states have to throw their rights away. I do not agree. I don't think you find any international law for that point. Maybe just your own opinion.
No, it's not my own opinion, it's the international opinion. But I would like to pick up what you said. We need not to prove 45 has always been tested. I agree from different sides. But it must be at least the willingness of democracies to defend the rule of law in the state as it is. If we weaken that, we will always be tested. And we should avoid a continuous testing of agreed law, agreed by parliaments freely elected, which is not everywhere the case in the world. Agreed law, which is achieved by the United Nations General Assembly, for example, and agreed coexistence as we have had over the last 30, 40, 50 years. So I have the impression that it is the task of your country to test how valuable and how ready the cohesion of partners in your neighborhood is. And therefore, be a little bit more cooperative and be able also, like you do, role model, really a great example, to visit international conferences and to test your attitude and the others test their attitude. But we should agree that at least that what was achieved via the United Nations should be not tested so often as it is just done. For example, also the UN clause and others here in the South China Sea and elsewhere.
Okay, we'll get the question. Please identify yourself.
Diplomatic affairs in the subnational level, such as using the UN Sister Cities framework. Thank you.
July.
I cannot hear you. Can you speak more slowly? Sorry. You went too fast.
Bisaya ako na nako ni.
I cannot hear you either.
What can you say about China's weaponization of the diplomatic affairs in the subnational level, such as using the UN Sister Cities framework? Do I need to define that a little bit?
Now I'm clear about your question. Okay.
Okay.
But I'm not clear about the situation on the ground.
Of course not.
But I do know that there are many programs on sister cities in China. Okay. If you look, perhaps Manila is a sister city with quite a few cities in China. Probably there are many of them. But I'm not quite sure whether the UN framework that you talked about is being dealt with in a sustained or organized way. This is not an area that I have done any work on. Thank you.
Okay, and maybe for the two other gentlemen, just what are your thoughts about them using, legitimate diplomatic frameworks like the sister cities to subvert national processes and national legislation and go directly to the local governments? Thank you.
Well, we know this twining concept in Europe, which was started after the Second World War, and this fostered the civil societies. It increased mutual understanding, but it was always even-handed, it was always financed by the municipalities, and it was always track two, that means the civil societies. And we are now trying to do this only with those who really desire it. For example, between the old harbor city Rostock at the Baltic Sea with Sfax in Tunisia, which is also a very old city for Phoenician founding, but this is also on the municipal level. The advantage is you engage people who are relevant. The disadvantage is the money needed is always too little. However, it is valuable because it's self-sustaining and the people are engaged. I have not the awareness how it is financed here in the region, and I avoid to mention this, but I would like to underline that the way it is organized in and from Europe, it is building mutual understanding and thereby fostering peace.
May I add? I think recently there has been a movement in establishing some kind of union of coastal cities around the world. Okay, maybe since you seem to be very interested in this area, maybe you can check on that and try to participate.
Okay. We have some questions from the media. It says there's a pending measure of the Senate, Senate Bill 2395. Senator Sherwin Gatchalian is the author. It seeks to prohibit foreign ships or aircraft from conducting unauthorized fishing, research, or survey activities in the West Philippine Sea. He has sought the establishment of a Philippine archipelagic sea lanes, etc., through this bill. If passed, how will it be enforced? I think this is the reason why it's a deliberative body. You refer it to committee, there are hearings, all of these questions will come out. How do you implement that? Is it reasonable? Does it violate international law? Will it violate our constitution, etc.? All of these questions will come up. And this is the beauty of a democracy, wherein these policies do not just blossom out or are not just brought down. They are debated and they are talked about. Brian De La Peña of TV5 says, in relation to the Philippine